to episode 294 of Late Night Linux, recorded on the 29th of July 2024. I'm Joe, and with me are Phelan.
75 goals for Ireland.
Graham.
Good evening.
And Will.
Hello.
Well, let's not talk about the Olympics, because that might still be going on, it might not, I don't know. We're recording this in the past, let's not worry too much about it. I saw a post on Mastodon by Josh Bressers, where he writes, I need some examples of common open source myths. This will have a security slant to it when I put it all together, but I'm not only looking for security examples, I want all types. And he lists some of his ones, and then there's a bunch of them in the replies. And I thought we could just shamelessly steal this for a segment. So let's hear your examples of open source myths.
The one that springs to mind is patches welcome. Sometimes, and I'm not going to say, let's just say sometimes, they're not welcome. An open source project could very well be an individual's personal project, and they know the direction in which they want it to go, and they know the style of code that they want, and they know the feature set that they want, and they're not interested in anybody else helping, nor are they interested in selling it or making money from it, and that's okay. But just because a project is open source doesn't mean that you are welcomed to contribute to it. Start on a cheery one.
Yeah. I don't know, how common that is. Surely that's relatively rare.
Yes, I think it is relatively rare, but it is not exceptional. I can think of one project, and now I can't remember what it was called. It was a database project that Ben Johnson wrote, and this is many years ago, and he hit, I think, the front page of Hacker News with his Patches Not Welcome blog post, where he explained why he didn't want it. You're welcome to use it, you're welcome to tweak it however you want, but he was responsible for it, and that's the way it was going to stay. And he made a lot of very important and, in my opinion, correct assertions about the way that a project could be successful if run by an individual.
Well, Josh says open source is more secure than closed source. And then he also says open source is less secure than closed source. Do you think that they're both myths and ultimately it doesn't matter whether it's open source or not? Roughly speaking, all software is as secure as any other?
I'd put a lot more trust in an open source project than I would in a closed source one, because somebody who isn't part of the project can fix it.
Yeah, that's another myth, isn't it? That someone is going to actually do that unless they get paid specifically to look for it, find it, and fix it.
Yeah, but also no, because there's been lots of times where projects have had a massive vulnerability and somebody has patched it, fixed it, and made it available. And we have often seen times when a proprietary company we don't know what they're doing with it. That's the thing. So nobody can fix it, nobody can help, and nobody knows what's going on. Only they do, and we're all sort of on the losing end of that thing.
Yeah, XZ, a classic example of how someone found that and prevented a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, look at that compared to, say, the very current, obviously now a month later, CrowdStrike or CrowdShite, whatever you want to call it, farce where a thing trusted a thing that it shouldn't have trusted, and nobody tested it on the way there, and nobody was any the wiser because they assumed that the company knows what they're doing.
Another one he says is, if the source code is available, it's open source.
That's becoming true.
Well, yeah, you could call it open source if you put it in your AI bullshit, yeah.
Yeah, it's always been dangerous, and we've always been told about the dangers of the term open source, but I think it's becoming true. But it's just the easiest way to describe it, isn't it? But it's not free software.
Well, it's not OSI approved, is it?
Yeah.
And I mean, if you're a big enough government, you have the Windows source code to look at, but it doesn't mean you own it.
One of the oldest has got to be that you can't sell open source software. And I think even though it's difficult to make money from open source software or free software, there are some people who are doing it and doing it successfully. It seems to me that Arda is a great example of this.
Oh, yeah. Totally.
And of course, you can sell the binaries. You just got to make sure that the source code is available. And I think that works for Krita and app stores where you're just paying for the convenience and the auto upgrades and that kind of thing.
And paying because maybe you want to support it. I mean, if they give you a way to support it and you can afford to do it, not like, this is going to cost you several £100 every year. You're like, if you can pay a decent amount and support it, it's a great way to be able to do that.
Yeah, I've always been a huge advocate of that. Stick it in the app stores, charge £10 for it or whatever.
Yeah.
They can always go to your website and download it for free. Or in the case of Ardo, they can always go and compile it themselves. I mean, say that Ardo's not that hard to compile, Graham.
Well, they do actually provide excellent documentation to build it yourself. So
Right. But at the end of the day, who is going to actually do that? Very few people, as long as the price is reasonable.
But imagine if you were a studio and you could buy this amazingly professional piece of software for literally buttons compared to anything else. How cool would that be? Just chuck them the money every month and you'd be happy.
yeah, and a really important part of this, and we all know that, is support. You want to pay for something because there's some kind of implied support that you might get through paying it, which is right. If you're running a music recording school, you want to be able to get help from the person who writes the software if you need it, rather than just having to look at the GitHub issue tracker or whatever it happens to be.
Another myth that I think is still around is that if you use open source software, especially Linux, you need to be really technical, it's going to be really difficult, and you're going to need to use the terminal loads.
Sigh.
I mean, you look at something like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, even Fedora potentially, there's no reason that you need to use the terminal. I mean, I would always say it's worth learning the terminal because it's quicker to do a lot of things, but you don't need to use it, do you? And you haven't done for like 15 years at this point, or at least 10 years. And yet that myth persists.
Who's behind that myth? That's the question. Redmond.
I don't know about that. Another myth, I don't know if it's a myth, but it's a misconception. And that is about free software being free as in beer. That is an unfortunate term, free software. And we've talked about this loads of times before about how free and free mean the same in English, but in almost every other language that I can think of, they're different words. But that misconception does persist, even with people who are advocating the use of Linux. They get confused about that. I suppose the question is, do we give a shit about that? Do we care? Probably not, when open source has very much won.
I do still think it's important because I think open source, well, we talked about this the last time, Mark Zuckerberg hoisting himself on top of that one for his not really open at all AI model. I mean, it gets co-opted quite often, and nobody's going to co-opt free software, let's face it. There is an awful lot of baggage along with free software, but nobody's going to co-opt it to try and cheat you out of something.
Unless it's a crypto wallet.
Well, again, that comes back to open source software is secure. That's the kind of sense that I have. I would much prefer to use open source software, but is it really more secure? I don't know.
I don't know, but it's like Phelim said earlier on, it's so much better the devil that you know. And if you've got the skills, you can at least look. You just don't have those options with proprietary software. And it's also much harder to deceive people, I think, in terms of reviews. You have to take whoever's word for it if it's closed source, whereas people can, if they have the skills, check.
Yeah, there was a recent security company called KnowBe4, which is a really weird name, but they hired a North Korean hacker by mistake and were very lucky to have caught them just before they employed them. And, with the XV thing, we obviously realized that there was something possibly state nation backed behind that. But, how many companies around there have got a guy that they've hired over COVID that they never really had an in-place interview with, and they have no idea what they're up to or who they are or have actually seen? Like, this guy was using a picture that he was then using AI to modify the model of a video of himself in the interview when he was doing it and stuff like that. It's
way.
Yes, it's crazy. I mean, it's unreal. And, you have to look at this and go, wow, okay. So, I mean, at least with open source, at least the code coming through each time. You can probably follow it and track it back. I mean, look at how well we tracked that back when it did occur. I mean, yes, your things are going to get through. But if you've got that history, at least you can look at it.
That is true. In the aftermath of the XZ thing, experts were able to forensically go through all the commits and everything because it had all been done in public.
And that's a huge, huge trump card, and we should be playing it far more often.
Yeah, compared to CrowdStrike, for example, where we just have to take their word for it.
Do you know what I like to hear was the fact that they said one of the things they're going to be implementing is developer testing of their own code. It's like, well, what the fucking hell were you doing before? Are you just doing no testing? Like, that's the least that I'd expect. Jesus.
I wonder if in the last 20 or 30 years, the view of open source software specifically in the US, has changed from being some sort of communist mind virus into the actual preferred methodology for software development in the sort of, I don't know, let's say modern software developer. Red Hat, I think, changed a lot of minds a long time ago, but I still feel like there was this kind of undercurrent of, it ain't right. And I wonder if that's now gone away.
I think it has completely gone away. I think that the pragmatic reasons to use open source have become clear to all and sundry, from end users to huge companies alike. It almost all of the time makes business sense to use an open source development model. And I think you're right. It was scary at first, this crazy new idea. But the facts are just plain to see that it is very often a better way to run a business.
Taking them down from the inside.
Well, do let us know some of your open source myths. show@latenightlinux.com. Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's 2.5 admins about system administration, Linux Matters for upbeat, family-friendly adventures, Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates, Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud, and Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So, if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at latenightlinux.com/support. Graham, it's been a while since you talked about Open Documentation Academy. How is that going? Give us an update.
Actually, I've been quite overwhelmed by how well it's gone. It seems like a pretty good model that maybe other projects could copy. Just as a reminder, the idea was to encourage people to get involved with open source and for them to get experience with working with open source projects and processes and going through the review processes and getting comments on your commits. We created a repository at Canonical called the Open Documentation Academy. And then I asked any kind of open source project that didn't have the capacity to work on perhaps documentation issues to create tasks in the Academy that people outside in the community could work on, and then get recognized for their contributions, and we could also help and mentor them through this. So, in fact, we've had like over 100 commits, and at the moment, I'm just looking, I think we've had 36 or 37 really valuable contributions to all the projects that are involved, and there's like 15 different projects that are involved now. I know this is at Canonical, but we don't want it to be. Openprinting.org is the only organisation outside of Canonical that's currently involved. But some of the projects involved have had their first ever kind of community contributions, which is also really kind of satisfying. I've helped a couple of people with their resume because of the contributions they've made, and even a little bit through the jobs that they've applied to do because they've been able to put their work at the Academy on their CVs or resumes.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. The whole idea of this was to get new people involved, and it sounds like that has happened then.
Yeah, I think it really has. We do like this public office hours recording on Google on a Friday. We get, maybe 20 or 30 people each week who are kind of involved with the task at that time or more interested in documentation, because we do kind of nerdy documentation subjects like Veil for testing, for example, or how we use Git and GitHub. And we have discussions about that. And people, to a certain extent, have kind of got behind this idea. It's like 4 or 5 months on, and so it's working much better than I ever thought it could. And it honestly seems to me like this idea where perhaps projects are too small to get enough attention on their own could come together to create a kind of aggregated list of tasks that other people then can make as a destination if they want to get involved in open source contributions.
Have you found that a core group comes back each time, or have you found new people come through each week?
Yeah, there's a couple of new people each week usually, and people they stay for a while, then maybe move on after they've made a few contributions and have perhaps found other ways. And I know that people who have initially contributed to the Academy have then gone on and made their own contributions to other projects after getting the experience.
Oh, that's cool.
So yeah, I am really pleased and a bit humbled by the success of it. Not the huge success of it, but even the fact that it's working, that the idea itself seems to be working even at the scale that we're trying to make it work at.
Yeah, I did see a bit of backlash when it was announced from people saying, oh, this is just Canonical looking for slave labor. But that seems to have died away and people are just getting on with it then.
Yeah, and to give Canonical its credit, that a lot of the technical authors at Canonical are doing this kind of, I mean, it's part of their work, but it's not part of our job description. They're kind of doing it as part of wanting to help the Academy, and that requires probably more effort than had they decided to write the documentation task themselves.
Is it counting towards your OKRs, though?
Please don't give them any ideas.
It's brilliant. Well done, Graham. Really an excellent program, and I'm glad that you're feeling successful about it. Well done.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it seems like a genuine contribution to open source.
Well, there's been a lot of us that have put work into it, so it's really not just me. But also, I would like to say, if anybody else wants to get involved or set up something similar, I'd be really happy to help or happy to invite you to the project.
Let's do some feedback then. Daniel writes, I would like to ask if maybe one day you could do a review on the Linux mobile scene. There are lots of cool projects on the go from Libre Mobile, Droidian, UbiPorts, PureOS, Fury Labs, and maybe Selfish OS. There appears to be lots of development and a promising future for Linux on mobile devices.
I can feel Adam Pig being activated on mention of...
Sailfish, yeah.
Yeah. No, Adam, nobody wants to use it. Fuck off.
For me, at least, it comes down to I went through a period of being quite into mobile Linux, but it quickly became clear to me that it was never going to catch up to Android and iOS, and that it was always going to be this cool community thing that is really interesting, and there's lots of development happening, and it is quite exciting in a sort of nerdy way, but that's it. It's never going to be on a par with the quote-unquote proper mobile operating systems. And I sort of lost interest, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking for a new phone as mine gradually dilapidates. It probably oxidizes itself to death at this point. But I would absolutely love a Linux phone, but it has to be useful as well. And AOSP plus F-Droid is pretty hard to beat. Even in my case, where I strip it right the way down, I don't use any Google apps, it's still hard to beat those apps that exist. If Linux had a reliable way of running Android apps as a way to get a leg up for extra functionality, and I would absolutely love to have a fully open kernel on a fully open system on a chip, but I doubt it's going to ever happen. That's the problem. The hardware is really the issue.
Yeah, and you mentioned being able to run them reliably. And there are ways to run Android apps, but 100% rock solid, reliable. You've got to look up the directions to, the emergency vet or whatever at 3 o'clock in the morning. I just don't think they're there.
And the thing is, I don't think there's anything wrong with Android / that AOSP thing. I just think if we had a decent set of open source software, that's a fairly reliable, good system to have. And if we have a open baseband for a chipset, that'd be fantastic. That'd be good enough, I would think.
You're right, though, that Lineage on an officially supported device with no Google apps and just F-Droid is so much better than any of the proper Linux on mobile experiences that I've ever had. It just sort of blows them all away, doesn't it?
Let's not look down at too much either. It is a Linux kernel and it is a open source ecosystem for building the apps. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. It's not a Linux distro, but you don't necessarily want a Linux distro on a phone. You don't necessarily want to use it the same way as you do a computer. As long as those things are open, as long as you have access to it, and as long as you have security updates and drivers that come in a fully open way, that's the real thing that you want to have.
And I don't want to shit on all these mobile Linux projects. It is a really hard problem to solve. You've got to have an individual image for every device. It's got to be a nightmare to try and get that working. And by the time you spend all your energy getting that stuff done, getting a consistent UI, getting the apps that are the most important part of it, the software to actually run on the thing, is just too hard and will always lag behind these multi-billion-dollar companies, trillion-dollar companies, making iOS and Android.
The ideal situation would be if we had some form of open board that was genuinely decent. It doesn't have to be the most lightning fast thing ever. if we had a board that we could base all that on.
No, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is the millions of apps that exist that people absolutely depend on.
Do they, though?
Yeah.
Do they really need all of those apps? I don't think they do.
Normal people do, Phelim. You are weird.
Yeah, but look, come on. A decent website that can adapt to what you are using, whether it be your PC or your phone, it shouldn't matter. There doesn't need to be a fucking app that fucking hoovers up every single click and twitch and gyroscopic movement of your phone to find out that you're on the shitter at the time that you're reading it. Like, and they go, oh, look, he's fucking holding it left-handed today. It means he's clearly wiping his arse. Let's tell him about rectal cancer and the dangers of not eating enough beef / vegetables / whatever winds the fucker up this time.
Yeah, but should is doing a lot of heavy lifting in your sentence there.
Is it, though? Is it?
We should be able to have a browser-based experience, but that's not the fucking world we live in, is it?
It could fucking easily well be if we don't fucking have to install all that shit. Java, come on, it's Java. Nobody wants Java.
It could be. In this dream world, it could be great, yeah. I would love for mobile Linux to be more than something fun to play with, but that's all it has been so far and all I fear it ever will be, unfortunately.
And you can go and buy a device that is that open all the way down in a sort of tablet form factor. So you could do that today with a device. I just don't think it'd be a lot of use.
Maybe we can capitalize on the, I suppose, very limited demand, but for low power devices without that many smart features, which I think is a valid, very niche market. But at least if we can have an open version of that, it's got its own kind of use case that isn't competing with Android and iOS.
Netbooks, eh? Good idea.
Yeah. Well, as long as there's SSH on it, I'd be happy.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. We'll be back next week when who knows what it'll be. But until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Phelim.
I've been Graham.
And I've been Will.
See you later.